Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us for the kickoff of Empty Spaces, Real Parking Needs at 5 TODs. This afternoon we're discussing a brand new resource from Smart Growth America and the University of Utah that you can download on our website at www.smartgrowthamerica.org/empty-spaces. We welcome your comments and questions about this new research. For those of you following along on the web for this event, you can type your questions into the chat box on your webinar screen. You can also tweet your questions at us on Twitter. Our handle is @SmartGrowthUSA, and the hashtag for this event is Empty Spaces. I'm Alex Dodds. I'm the Communications Director here at Smart Growth America, and thank you again to everyone listening for joining us. We've got a great set of panelists who are going to be discussing this new research today. First, you're going to hear from Chris Zimmerman, Vice President for Economic Development here at Smart Growth America. And then you're going to hear from Professor Reed Ewing of the University of Utah. He's the principal author of this research, and he'll be talking a little bit more about the findings. As the title of this report implies, this research looks at 5 transit-oriented development stations, including one in Los Angeles and one in the city of Englewood, Colorado. And we have 2 panelists who are going to be talking about each of those places. Patricia Diefendorfer from the city of Los Angeles, the senior planner there, and Harold Stitt, senior planner at the city of Englewood, Colorado. To start off our program for today, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Chris Zimmerman, Vice President for Economic Development here at Smart Growth America. Chris?
Thanks, Alex. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're listening from. The renaissance of downtowns and the growing demand for walkable urban environments all over the country has made transit-oriented development a key economic development strategy in cities all around the country. It's also meant that prices for this kind of development have been rising as demand runs ahead of supply. Important thing to keep in mind with transit-oriented development generally is that nearness to station is really important. The land close to the station is the most valuable, and that has a number of implications, one of which is that parking lots near them is generally a less valuable way to use that land than development, places where people live and work and do business. But that means, in turn, that there's a need for structuring parking for those developments. And that has cost implications for the development, and that's why the topic we're discussing today is so important. Structured parking is expensive, and therefore the question of how much you need becomes very important. Now, to emphasize this, let me just point out a kind of a basic kind of rule of thumb about transit-oriented development, which is that the quarter mile closest to the station will tend to draw about 75% of the riders. That is, those who are going to walk to a station are mostly going to come within the first quarter mile. And if you do the arithmetic, that means there's about 126 acres near the station that are really, really important. And again, that is part of the reason why this is so important and why it can be said that every foot matters when it comes to real estate. Near a rail station, as this article in the Washington Post a while back said, citing some other research that was done by real estate firms like Cushman & Wakefield, and identified that, in fact, there's a pretty tight gradient so that the value is really highest closest to the station. And, in fact, when you move away, even within that quarter mile, you see that impact as the graph shows. So, it just emphasizes the fact that the land close by is really, really valuable. And since that means you're going to be structuring parking, which is very expensive, that means that you're adding cost to a project potentially in the millions, given that structured parking spaces, cost tens of thousands of dollars a piece. And so getting the level of parking right is really important. Too much can render projects unviable financially, and it clearly can impact the affordability of whatever is built. So this question of how much parking is needed is really important. Till now, communities make regulations based on whatever available information they have, and there are some old practices that aren't necessarily based on transit-oriented development that have gotten embedded in regulations in zoning codes, for instance. There are engineering practices And there are the general guidelines used by people who finance developments, all of which are basing the assumption about the need for parking on environments that aren't necessarily TOD. And for a long time, it's been observed that those require more parking than people generally think is needed for TOD. The new research that Professor Ewing is about to talk about gives us more insight than we've had and more quantitative support for the notion that the parking that is required for TOD is less, and in fact substantially less, than has previously been thought. And that is significant because as we see demand very high for transit-oriented development and the supply having a hard time keeping up with it, one of the obstacles, of course, is this question of how much you have to sink into putting structured parking in those developments. And if we can make an adjustment on that, we might see a significant increase in the supply and perhaps also the affordability of transit-oriented development, which is why this new research is so exciting. But probably the best thing to do is let Professor Ewing tell you about the work that he and his team of researchers have done and the results that they've come up with. Reed? Reed, you may have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. This is the study. It's called Trip and Parking Generation at TODs. A couple of my doctoral students, Guang Tian and Tori Lyons, plus others were involved. Farron Piers, a transportation consulting firm, and Nelson Nygaard, another transportation consulting firm, helped with data collection. So our own work on mixed-use developments, we've got an extensive database, 412 mixed-use developments around the U.S. suggests that we, transportation professionals using standard sources, overestimate the number of vehicle trips generated by mixed-use developments by something like 35%. Now that, of course, when it comes time to impose exactions and impact fees, to set parking requirements, that escalates development costs, and it has the potential to heighten community resistance to projects because projects do not have as much impact as our numbers say they will. So what we've tried to do is improve the accuracy of the trip and parking generation estimates considerably through the study I'm about to describe. The tendency for transportation professionals is to default to two manuals by the Institute of Transportation Engineers. One is the Trip Generation Manual, the other is the Parking Generation Manual. And in the absence of other numbers, hard numbers or hard evidence, it's not unreasonable to default to these two national sources, since you don't know whether the discount with transit-oriented development is 10% or 20% or 30%. So, just go with the numbers that are widely accepted from these two manuals. The problem with that is that the two manuals state themselves that the data upon which they're based come from suburban locations with little transits or pedestrian amenities. That's true of the Trip Generation Manual. The IT Parking Generation Manual says that the sites studied are primarily isolated suburban sites, just the opposite of TOD, of transit-oriented development. Now, there have been studies. A lot of the work previously was done by a guy named Robert Cervero, who is at UC Berkeley. He's done the seminal work on trip generation and parking generation for residential projects that are close to transit. Now, those are important projects, but those aren't transit-oriented developments in the same sense we're using the term, the more conventional sense. A transit-oriented development dating back to the earliest days, the early 1990s, when the term was coined, referred to mixed-use developments with shopping and a residential component, maybe some offices, entertainment uses. What the existing literature on residential projects close to transit suggests is steep discounts or reductions in both vehicle trips and parking demand, but that doesn't apply to the class of developments we've studied, which are mixed use, dense, and I'll describe them in greater detail in just a second. And why that's so important is shown in this next slide. You have, and this is just a hypothetical, but you've got internal trips that never leave the development. It's someone going downstairs from an apartment to get a cup of coffee. You've got walk trips into the development and out of the development. You've got transit trips in and out of the development, and then what's left over are the vehicle trips, the auto trips. And as this shows, in this illustration, the walk trips, internal trips, and transit trips can constitute a very large proportion of all the trips. And this is in fact what we found. And of course, they're bike trips too, but they're on the order of 2 to 4% of all trips, and that's why that's not shown there. So we took a definition which is fairly standard and went looking for transit-oriented developments. So TODs are dense. These are multi-story projects. Mixed use, they have residential and commercial and public uses ordinarily. Pedestrian friendly, the streets are designed not just for cars but for pedestrians. The ones we looked at are literally adjacent to transit. There's no impedance in going from an apartment to the transit station because they're right next to each other. Built after transit was in place, so the parking requirements would reflect the availability of high-quality transit, fully developed or nearly so, and with self-contained parking. And that was an important criterion because we wanted to be able to count parked cars. And you can't do that in the typical downtown where parking is shared in public garages. So we needed to find TODs with their own parking garages and parking lots attached to buildings so we could count parking demand. Now, the way we found our TODs was off of our mixed-use development database, which has, as I mentioned, 412 TODs, or mixed-use developments, some of which are TODs. We contacted regional transit agencies and metropolitan planning organizations. We looked at Google satellite imagery, looked at stations to see what was around them, and then I conducted site visits to 10 regions. And here are the 10 that popped up as meeting all of our criteria. And these were, in my opinion, the best examples of TOD as we've defined them. We actually ended up studying only 5, and the reason for that was just cost. These studies are extremely expensive, which maybe accounts for the fact that no one, to our knowledge, has done this before. We were spending about $12,000 per site, sending out large teams of people to count cars and count individuals coming and going from all the building entrances and to conduct intercept surveys. So the 5 have already, you can see them there, and I'll talk about them as I go, but one is in Seattle, Redmond TOD, another in Washington, D.C., Rhode Island Row, a third in Oakland, Fruitvale Village, a fourth in Denver, Englewood TOD, and then Wilshire, Vermont in Los Angeles. And this is just typical of what these things look like. This is Rhode Island Row. You climb off the metro in D.C., you go down a flight of stairs, you cross over some bus transfer stations, bus bays, where buses are waiting, and you then are on a main street. And Main Street has ground floor retail and services and restaurants, and it has apartments above. and as you can see, it also has parking structures built into the buildings themselves. So this is a typical TOD. These are small. We're talking, except for Englewood, about 5 acres or less, with fairly high densities in most cases. So the way we collected the data, as I mentioned, Farron Piers and Nelson Igard did the actual data collection, was to count all people entering and exiting all of the buildings between early in the morning and late in the evening, doing parking occupancy counts every other hour into the early morning hours, so we would capture the maximum residential demand when everyone was home and in bed and the cars were parked. And then we did intercept surveys. We also counted all the cars as they came into the parking lots and parking structures. In the intercept surveys, we said, how did you get here, by what mode, and what was the purpose of your trip? And we had typically 2 people at each of the entrances, one doing the counts and the other doing the surveys. The stationing of these people was critical. They had to cover, in many cases, more than one building entrance. These are 2 examples. One is Wilshire, Vermont, and the other is Englewood, and you can see how many people are involved. We're doing another study soon at City Creek Center in Salt Lake City, and we're going to have 30 people out counting and surveying. And here's kind of the most interesting stuff. The mode shares are very impressive. The smallest percentage of non-auto is Redmond TOD, which does not have rail. It only has a bus transit, and it's over 30% walk and transit mode share, leaving something less than 70% auto. You can see that in the extreme cases like Fruitvale in Wilshire, Vermont, you're getting close to 70% non-auto, leaving only 30% auto. When we did the actual analysis, we compared the number of vehicle trips. These are car trips, which we were counting cars as they came in and went from parking garages and parking lots. The number of vehicle trips, the actual number relative to the ITE calculation, or the ITE rates, are shown in this next image. So what we did to get the ITE numbers is we looked at the number of units, dwelling units, multiplied by the ITE rate for that type of dwelling unit, apartments, 3 to 5 story apartments. We looked at the square footage of all the non-residential uses and used the ITE rates per 1,000 square feet, multiplied the number of 1,000 square feet by the rates, added them all up, and got a number which is our denominator. And as you can see there, these developments are generating typically 50% or less of the ITE estimated rate of vehicle trips. The one exception is Englewood. Harold will be talking about that. I'd love to answer questions about Englewood. It's the most auto-oriented and largest of the developments we studied. But if you take an example like Rhode Island Row, it's generating just about a third as many vehicle trips as the ITE manual says it should, given the number of units and the number of square feet of commercial uses. This is another graphic. This one shows parking, and the blue line is, blue bars are residential parking supply, and the green bars are peak demand for residential. This is middle of the night counts, and you can see that the typical apartment, according to IT, is generating requires between supply between 1.4 spaces per unit and 2 spaces per unit, and these, except for Englewood, are coming in much lower than that. The average is just over the average supply number is just over one space supplied per dwelling unit, and the demand is much less than that. As you can see in case of Rhode Island Row, a very low actual peak parking demand for residential uses. The reason there's no bar for Fruitvale is that parking is shared. So all the residential parking is shared with commercial uses. During the day, the commercial uses are filling the spaces. At night, the residential are, and that's why we don't have a bar there. This is probably the most interesting slide, I think. This shows the peak parking demand for these developments relative to the ITE supply guidelines. So for all the commercial and all the residential, if you build to the ITE standards, you get a number of parking spaces required. The actual number filled at peak time is less than 50% of the ITE supply guideline, which means that if you build to ITE, you're oversupplying parking by over 100%. Now, the numbers, as you could see, those bars were different for the different developments. And why were they? A couple of the developments share parking between residential and commercial uses. Fruitvale and Rhode Island Row share parking, so that reduces the total amount of parking required in the amount actually used. Unbundled residential parking at Fruitvale and Rhode Island Row, where the parking space or two parking spaces doesn't come with your rent. You have to pay for the space on top of the rent if you want it, and if you don't want it, of course, you don't have to pay anything. And that reduces demand. When people have to pay $95 a month for parking, they demand less of it. And then paid commercial parking at Fruitvale, Rhode Island Row, and Wilshire, Vermont. These are developments that charge commercial users, shoppers who come, a market rate to park in the garage, and that also depresses parking demand. You get more people coming by foot and transit, and fewer by automobile. If you work out the numbers, taking typical cost per space numbers from different sources, it's around $20,000 per garage space is kind of a typical thing. It's much higher in certain cities because land is so expensive, meaning structured parking so expensive. What we did is we simply worked it out for Redmond TOD, the one in Seattle, to build the parking structure. And this is, by the way, this is not the park and ride structure. This is the TOD structure, which is under the apartments and separate from the park and ride. It costs about $8 million to build, and of that, about $2 million worth of parking is unused. So in these developments, even though they're supplying a lot less parking than ITE suggests, they're not using all of it. $2 million could be saved, maybe, or a portion of that, by providing less parking. If you build to ITE standards, the parking would cost $14 million, and $8 million of that would be unused at the peak demand time. Okay, so just the last few slides. This shows that there are potential economies with shared parking. These developments, all of them except Englewood, don't share parking between park and ride transit users and TOD residents and shoppers. They have separate parking, but you can see that the parking demand peaks at different times, park and ride during the day, for example, and residential at night, and you could achieve economies by sharing some of the parking between transit, park and ride users and TOD residents and shoppers. Here's another one. This is Wilshire, Vermont. And by the way, our final report has these graphs for all of them, the 2-hour parking counts. And you can see there that Wilshire, Vermont has separate parking for residents versus commercial users. And you can see again the parking peaks at different times for the different users. And there would be the potential for economies through shared parking. It was a kind of a surprise to me that there wasn't more shared parking among our exemplary TODs. And just wrapping up, we've got 2 articles that have been written for peer-reviewed journals. They're both published. The Empty Spaces report sends you to the website if you want to acquire these. But it turns out, I just found this out, that the NITSE, National Institute of Transportation, or National Institute for Transportation and Communities website has both of these as PDFs that you can download. One's in Landscape and Urban Planning, the other's in the journal Transportation. Peer review is the gold standard for academics. And I just want to end by acknowledging our supporters, financial supporters. NITSE, National Institute for Transportation and Communities, provided a lot of the funding. UTA, the Utah Transit Authority, UDOT, and the 2 MPOs, Wasatch Front Regional Council and Mountainland Association of Governments, provided supplemental funding. You might ask, why was UDOT interested in a study of TOD, parking and trip generation? Well, if we can provide housing and not generate so many vehicle trips, obviously that makes their lives easier. So I'm done with this, and I'm going to pass it on to Patricia.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much. This is Patricia Diefendorfer from the City of Los Angeles. I'm glad to be here with you. So I'm going to give you a little bit of sort of background of the context that we're doing our planning in, and then kind of go right into the Vermont Wilshire, station, and then tell you a little bit about some of the things that we're going to be doing in the future. So in California, we have state and regional mandates to reduce our greenhouse gases. So that largely depends from a land use perspective on more sustainable development patterns that encourage growth near transit. Both state and regional plans and laws require us to do so. And much of our general plan and our activities are trying to accomplish this. So in Los Angeles, we have a pretty young transportation system. Our first light rail line, which is the blue line, you might be able to see that on the map, was built in 1990. The system has been growing, and the voters of the county have approved 2 sales tax increases to fund transportation. So you can see that between the 2, our transportation system is expected to grow in the way that you see we're toggling between the existing system map and the future system map with all of the improvements that are planned. So I always like to tell people that in Los Angeles, even though people don't think of us as a particularly transit-oriented place, we've been doing transit-oriented district planning and TODs for a long time. As far back as 2000 and 2001, we started looking at neighborhoods that have transit and thinking about how to increase the intensity of development around transit, make those areas more walkable. So you can see, for example, the Vermont Western Station Neighborhood Area Plan looks at 4 of the subway stations. The same line that the Wilshire, Vermont station is on, these are other stations along that line. And it really looks to improving the pedestrian orientation, directing growth to those areas. And you can see the Cornfield Arroyo Seco plan, which is a newer plan, takes a largely old industrial area and reimagines it as a more jobs-intensive but also generally mixed-use, pedestrian-friendly, transit-oriented area. And Warner Center, that plan is actually a plan for a 1960s, 70s kind of auto-oriented jobs center. And it was recently, a plan was done to reimagine it as a mixed-use, pedestrian-oriented area. So more recently, we are in the midst of a pretty large program to update plans and zoning regulations for around a number of transit stations. We have 2 grants from our transportation authority. It's called Metro, and we have about $7.5 million to do land use planning around 26 stations along 6 lines. And you can see the circles along the various lines are the stations that we're doing planning for currently, including much of our downtown, which is in the center of that map. Okay, so in in Los Angeles in general, we have many different contexts. As you might imagine, we have everything from a very intense urban downtown that's very, dense and mixed use to we have transit that runs through, as you can see on the right-hand side there, neighborhoods that are almost single-family neighborhoods. And you can see this one. This is our Expo line, which is one of our newer light rail lines with downtown in the background there. So moving right along to the Wilshire, Vermont project, I want to tell you a little bit about this project. First I'm going to tell you a little bit about the neighborhood. Sorry. So Koreatown is the neighborhood in which this station is located. I think what's interesting to note about this station, this is an area that's about 3 miles from our downtown. It is very dense. It's got a density of about 42,000 people per square mile, which is much more dense than the city on average, which is more like about 8,300 people per square mile. This neighborhood, so it is much more dense than most of the city. It has many more people who are foreign-born, and it has a lower household median income than the rest of the city. So I just wanted to show you that the project that is the focus of Professor Ewing's research is the project where you can see, maybe not so well, but there's an M shown there. That's the transit station, and that's the site of the project that was a joint development project that I'm going to tell you a little bit more about. But I think it's interesting to note here that we mapped kind of the projects, the more significant projects in the area, and you can see that a lot of the activity has been occurring since 2013. So what's interesting about that is the station was built and was operational in '96. The Metro Joint Development Project was built in 2007. And it certainly, I think, has catalyzed development. And since 2013, there's been a lot more activity. And that development is going to essentially add about 2,600 units and more than 90,000 square feet of commercial. So focusing on the site, I think what's interesting about this site in particular is that it was owned by the Transportation Authority. So it's publicly owned land, and obviously there was a lot more control over the type of project and what could happen there. So our Metro has a joint development program, which they engage with a private developer, do ground leases, and invite private developers to actually do the development. The site is about 3.2 acres. It has 449 units, 90 of which are affordable. And I think that's an important point. I think that's equates to 15 to 20% affordable, and certainly, lower income people tend to be core transit riders, so that's important. It has 36,000 square feet of retail, and there's a middle school that's developed to the north of it. So this is another project that has occurred across the street from the project that we just showed you. It was approved in 2006, but was constructed in 2014. And it's a large project, but I like to point out with this project, and I forgot to mention, in the past project, the amount of parking that was provided was about a 15% reduction from what our code requires. So the research really focuses on the reduction from the ITE standards, but that project represents 15% reduction from what our code requires. And this one, because it was approved a long time ago, it only represents about 4.5% of our reduction from our code. I think if we were actually approving it today, it would probably be a very different project. One of the downsides of this project is not only that it has a substantial amount of parking, but that the parking, in the terms of the design of the building, you can probably see, is very prominent, and that's not really desirable. So I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but this is what we're calling a newer generation project. It's going to be a large project that's going to be adaptive reuse of an existing building and new housing units on the surface parking lot that serve the old building. So I wanted to take a moment to just tell you what some of the things that we're doing as a result of what we've learned from our experience with TOD. Largely, We do, I think, as a city, really acknowledge and understand that you don't need as much parking near transit, but we still have a lot of skepticism among our community members. So it's really hard to talk about parking reductions in some neighborhoods. The fact that we don't have reduced parking as a matter of right, though, presents a lot of design challenges, and of course it degrades the pedestrian environment and adds to the cost of the development, as we've noted from the research. So really, even though we have a really strong commitment to reducing parking near transit, our regulations don't reflect that. And we are working currently both through our TOD plans for those 26 stations that you saw, and through a complete revision of our zoning code to think about parking differently and to introduce regulations that really encourage reduced parking more as a matter of right and not through discretionary land use processes, which is what the process is today. So some of the things that we're looking at are having different parking ratios for different parts of the city. Right now we really have, except for the downtown, we have a one-size-fits-all approach to the requirements. We're looking very much at unbundling parking and doing that through a lot of our TOD plans. We're looking very much at shared parking being shared among the different uses, which I think Professor Ewing's research really corroborates both of those things as being successful strategies. We are also looking to do things, in particularly neighborhoods where there's not a lot of acceptance of parking reductions. We're trying to do it in kind of small ways, like exempting small neighborhood serving uses from having to meet parking requirements, and also exempting changes of use in existing buildings from having to meet any new or additional parking requirements. We're also looking at things like counting above grade parking as counting towards your floor area ratios as a way to discourage above grade parking for both design reasons and to generally reduce the amount of parking in projects. So those are just some of the strategies that we're looking at right now. And I think I'm going to wrap up my comments and ask Harold to go ahead and share their experience about Englewood. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. This is Harold Stitt from the City of Englewood. It's a pleasure to be here with you this afternoon or morning, depending on what part of the country you might be in. I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about City Center Englewood, which was, again, one of the stations areas that Reed studied. It's a location that was formerly a shopping center. In fact, it was the primary source of revenue for the city when it was built in the mid-1960s. It was 1.3 million square feet of shopping that filled the coffers with sales tax that enabled the city to add significant amount of amenities to the community. Of course, as a shopping center, they all have a lifespan, and in the mid-'80s it became clear that as suburbanization took place in the Denver metro area, the market share for the mall began to decrease substantially, so the revenue obviously was decreasing as well. And the city was beginning to face the realization that the shopping center could go dark at some point, and what would happen with 50 plus acres in your downtown being vacant. So we began looking at what might happen for the future of Cinderella City. At the same time, the Denver Regional Transportation District, the transportation provider for the metro area, began looking at expanding the initial light rail system, and there were a couple different corridors that were being considered. The southwest corridor, which runs along South Santa Fe Drive adjacent in Englewood, and a southeast corridor, which is along the Interstate 25 route. RTD decided to use the southwest corridor as the next expansion of the light rail system. Cinderella City is adjacent to the light rail line, and we took that as an opportunity to kind of piggyback on the significant public investment in transit that RTD was making in the area. And it was also quite timely that Cinderella City was beginning its downward slide. We looked at different options. Transit-oriented development was a relatively new concept in the late 90s when we began this process, and there wasn't much guidance. We brought on some consultants to look at what possibilities there might be. The city also engaged a development team to solicit proposals for the redevelopment of the site. A little bit of backstory to the Cinderella City Mall. It was built on a city park in the mid-1960s, and through a series of transactions and negotiations, the parking structure that was built around this mall or the land that the parking structure was built on was retained by the city. So the city owned not quite half of the ground that the mall occupied, the 50-plus acres. When the mall started going down, we began negotiating with the owners of the mall, and in the end, much of the shopping center was donated to the city. Of course, the owners at the time get some tax benefits from that. There were some parts of the mall property that the city had to purchase, but we ended up owning the entire 50-plus acres. The city created essentially a development corporation to begin looking at how the site might redevelop. We got several proposals from national groups. We selected one and then began the development process by negotiating how the development would look. In the end, we had to not only educate ourselves about transit-oriented development, but also the development team that was put together. And eventually we got to the point where we created what we've called as a hybrid TOD. It has many of the characteristics of an urban TOD, but it also has the suburban shopping elements that you would not expect in what most people would consider a transit-oriented development. A Walmart, as you can see on the screen. In fact, one of the interesting things about the development is Walmart exerted a significant amount of pressure on the city when the development was being created. In fact, they demanded in their development agreement that our residential component be parked at 1.5 spaces per unit, which is clearly a suburban standard, when in fact we were interested in a 1 car per unit standard, building off the presence of the transit there. The number of parking spaces that were developed for the site were based on looking at the typical or imagined configuration and combination of uses on the site, taking that gross number of parking spaces based on what our comprehensive zoning ordinance would require, and then taking a look at how there is overlap or uses that are compatible that can share parking. And so we were able to reduce the overall number of parking spaces by not quite a third. Even though we still have a significant number of parking spaces on the site. There's probably 2,500 parking spaces on the 50-acre site. We have about 350,000 square feet of retail, 40,000 square feet of office. There are 438 apartments in 2 separate buildings on the site. And then we have our civic building here, which is approximately 140,000 square feet. One of the issues that arose early on was trying to convince retailers that they did not need as much parking as they typically would have in a commercial parking situation in a suburban area. And so restaurants, for instance, were always clamoring for 15 parking spaces per 1,000 square feet. Well, we had a difficult time convincing them that you have a built-in demand with the transit. And one of the lessons that we learned was stick to your guns when it comes to negotiating, and hopefully over the last 16 years as transit-oriented development have matured from what we started with in the early or in the late 1990s and early 2000s. They're more accepting of the fact that transit brings customers to your businesses. The other thing we learned is the park and ride that was developed for this site is on the north side of the development, and patrons who are availing themselves of the light rail do not walk through the development. So we missed an opportunity to have parking in a location that would actually energize the commercial component of our development. If we were to do it again, we would be a lot more determined to move things around. I think at the time it was the best we could do. The lessons learned are you have to stick to your guns, and we were fortunate because we had the ability to call some of the shots since we owned the ground. We also put a significant amount of our own resources into this development as a public-private partnership. Englewood is a small, landlocked community, so our resources aren't that great. But it was believed by the council and the staff at the time that this was an opportunity to make a bold statement about how transit could work to energize your community and provide amenities that you might not otherwise be able to attract. I think with that, I will turn it over to Alex to finish up.
Thank you so much, Harold, and thanks also to Patricia and Reed and Chris for all of your comments. This has been such an interesting conversation, and we're going to now open it up for a few questions and answers. If you're following along on the web, you can type your question into your webinar screen. There's a chat box that we'll be keeping an eye on. Well, you can also tweet them at us. Our username is SmartGrowthUSA, or you can use the hashtag #EmptySpaces. So I'm going to take the first question because it's the number one question we always get, which is, will this webinar be recorded? And the answer is yes. We will be posting it on our website later this week, and you can listen to this full conversation as well as see all of the webinar slides again, so not to worry. And if you have been taking notes furiously, you can take a rest because it will be recorded. The second question I'm going to give to Reed, and I would love, Patricia and Harold, your comments also. The question is it typical for TOD to build less parking than ITE recommends? Most of the projects included in this report built less parking than official guidelines recommend. Is that common? How common is it? Are developers and municipalities is this sort of commonly held knowledge, or do you think that it's something that only a few folks are doing? And Reed, why don't you start us off?
Well, thank you. Thanks for that question, and also for tuning into this webinar. Yeah, it is. We have a limited sample. One of the weaknesses of our study is just our sample size. 5. We wanted 10. We're going to be doing a couple more trip and parking generation studies in the springtime. One at City Creek Center, which is located here in Salt Lake, and another at Orenco Station in Hillsboro, on the West Side Max line out of Portland. So we'll know more, but right now we're talking about a sample of 5. And all 5 of them, with one exception, and I'll talk about that in just a second, supply a lot less parking than the ITE parking generation manual suggests they do. And they in some cases, just a fraction of the ITE rate. Someone in one of the questions talked about Fruitvale not having enough parking, and that's a case where the parking supply is way below the ITE rate. Now, Harold mentioned that Englewood was pressed by Walmart to supply more parking. And residential uses at Englewood are the only place among our 5 that are supplying more parking than even ITE requires. But in all other cases, they're supplying a lot less. And I'll just you need to get the final report off the NHTSA website because it has detailed tables on all of these. But, for example, Redmond, kind of typical, supplies per residential unit 1.19 parking spaces. The ITE standard is 2 parking spaces per dwelling unit. The actual demand at Redmond peak demand is 0.86 parking spaces per dwelling unit. So the demand is less than the supply, and the supply is less than the ITE guideline by quite a bit. The ITE guideline of 2, supply of 1.19, and demand of 0.86.
Thanks, Reed.
Hi there. This is Patricia. I just wanted to add that, I can't exactly speak to the reduction as it relates to the ITE standard. What I can speak to is the reduction as it relates to our zoning code requirements. And as I mentioned, I think it is fairly typical in the city of LA that TOD projects have a lower parking, they provide less parking than the code would require. But unfortunately, I think right now, in many cases, it's a discretionary process that you have to go through. You have to ask to not meet the code. As I mentioned, with the work that we're doing now, hopefully that will be less so, that it will be as a matter of right.
Patricia, that's a great segue to the next question here, and I'd like to hear from you and Harold about this. There are a bunch of different forces that sort of shape the final amount of parking that gets built. How much would you say for your particular projects was the issue? What was the relationship between parking policy and the developers and the financing and the community? How would you say that balance worked out? And maybe Harold, we can start with you.
Yes, in our situation, since it was a relatively new project in terms of TOD in the Denver area, we did have to deal with the financiers who say you need to have a certain number of parking spaces. The developers who didn't have any experience with TOD, and so they have experience building shopping centers and strip malls and whatnot. And we retained Walker Parking to perform the analysis to determine how shared parking would work on the site. But the biggest hurdle was convincing the retailers and the commercial users that, in our opinion, transit displaces parking in terms of the number of parking spaces that you need. So it was an ongoing battle, and even today we have retail space in our center that it's difficult to fill because the retailers look at it and say, well, you don't have enough parking on the site.
Hi, this is Patricia again. I definitely would say that all of those things that you mentioned do factor in. There's the policy objective of trying to have less parking. There's definitely community concerns about parking reductions in individual projects, and we definitely hear that financiers of projects expect to see certain amount of parking, certain ratios, and that we definitely try to balance all of those things. On the whole, I believe that usually the outcome with projects is responding to all of those issues. And so it's kind of a negotiation, especially because it is often done through some kind of discretionary process. I would say I believe that there's growing acceptance on the part of financiers in like downtown Los Angeles, for example. I don't think they're expecting to see as much parking as they may have in the past. So I think that the tide is turning on that. And certainly our communities are very different. In downtown, the community stakeholders don't expect to see a lot of parking, but in other parts of the city, on the west side, maybe in the northeast, in the valley, they still are reluctant to see significant parking reductions.
So that's a great segue to the next question from our listeners, which we're getting tons of questions about sort of the technical applications of this research and what to do with this information. Lots of folks are writing in, working for a local city that has TOD and wants to sort of know, I've seen several questions along these lines, basically, how can I or someone working on a new TOD station estimate the parking that I would need? Obviously, ITE guidelines are not perfect, if that's a gentle way to put that here, and these 5 TODs are helpful information, but I guess we can start with Reed, we can start with you. What tips would you give to someone working on TOD about how to estimate their own parking needs?
Yeah, great question. We have in the final chapter of the report, not the Smart Growth America Empty Spaces report, but the NHTSA report. We have a whole section on how our numbers might be used. And we acknowledge initially that in N, or sample, 5 is smaller than you'd like, but we suggest that that our numbers might be used to bound what is a reasonable parking supply. In other words, you would want to supply at least as much as the development that with the smallest amount of parking requires, and probably not a lot more than the development with the largest amount requires. We say that where you can match your TOD to one of ours, that would be a reasonable thing to do. Like, for example, in Salt Lake we have something like 9 self-contained TODs in planning right now, and so if I would probably look to Englewood as the best analog for a TOD in Salt Lake. Ours are going to be a little more auto-oriented. We have light rail. Denver and Salt Lake City in some respects are comparable cities. So that's one possibility, just trying to match your TOD to one of our 5, and you'll find that when you read the report, there's just a ton of information on all 5 of them. We think that our numbers can be used in concert with regional travel demand models. That one can, with a regional travel demand model, one can estimate a mode share for a development in a traffic analysis zone, and that gives you, at least for the transit portion of the demand, it gives you a sense of how many trips will be transit versus auto trips. Doesn't help you with the walk trips much, although some models do include walk trips. But that's another way to do it. And ultimately, we say we're going to keep doing this kind of research because once we have Orenco, a large TOD in Portland, it may provide a better match to a larger TOD in some region with light rail. It'll also do something which we have not done, and some of the listeners may have realized this, but we did not include an internal capture percentage. We will at Orenco, because it's large enough to have a high internal capture, add that to our survey so we know how many trips start and end within the development.
Great, thank you, Reed. Patricia or Harold, do you have any tips? And this is probably how we'll end the conversation since we're almost at the top of the hour again. Basically, what tips would you give to someone else doing the type of work that you've done and over how to figure these questions out?
Hi, this is Patricia. A few thoughts that come to mind is that I do think there's value. This research is very valuable because it sort of confirms what we instinctively feel and anecdotally, understand. I think it's interesting to try to use the different examples, the 5 case studies, as a typology that you could relate to one of your own stations. Like if the station is most similar to one of these 5, you could probably consider those the parking ratios shown through the study as being appropriate for your station area. I think in LA we are doing a couple things that are going to be really helpful. We are actually, because of our state environmental laws, and we're moving to using vehicle miles traveled as a metric for transportation impacts. It's forcing us to look a lot more at vehicle trip generation, and I think that's going to lead to a better understanding of how parking is used. We've got consultants trying to look at the localized experience related to that so that we have more local and not this national ITE evidence to rely upon. I saw a question from one of the participants about asking actual developers to share their parking utilization information with cities, and I think some of our plans are embedding that more, and our transportation department, whenever we have a transportation demand management arrangement with any developer, is starting to ask for that information. So I think we're going to start to get more localized information and evidence of the way parking is being used.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that Patricia said. One of the biggest problems that we as planners have is convincing the transportation engineers that just because it's in the manual doesn't make it so for everybody. And gathering information from other jurisdictions, other studies such as what Reed has put together, give us a toolbox that we can take to development or apply to developments that show that traditional views of parking should be thrown out the window when you're dealing with transit as a major component of a development.
Great. Thank you, Harold. That's going to conclude our conversation for today. Thank you so much again to all of our panelists and everyone who is listening. I know that we did not get to many of the questions that people answered. We will try to get to some more of them on our blog at smartgrowthamerica.org. We'll post a recording of this event and try to get to some of the additional questions. You can also give a read to the full report at smartgrowthamerica.org/empty-spaces, that has a lot more information in it. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.